Welcome to Accreditation Unlocked, the podcast where we explore accreditation, leadership, planning, and continuous improvement, not as compliance exercises, but as real leadership work. I'm Dr. Ken Clough from the Accreditation Collaborative. In this podcast, I work with presidents, provosts, deans, faculty leaders, and institutional teams who are trying to do accreditation thoughtfully, while also leading complex organizations with limited time, limited resources, and competing demands. Each episode is a reflection on practice. What actually happens in institutions? What leaders experience? And what sustainable improvement really requires? Today's episode is a little broader than accreditation alone. It's about leadership. Specifically, what it means to lead when so much of what matters is outside of your direct control. And while accreditation will come up, it's just one of the places where this leadership reality becomes visible. Leading within limits. There's a quiet tension that shows up in almost every leadership role, whether you're leading an institution, a division, a department, or a team. You're responsible for outcomes. You're accountable for progress. And yet, so much of what shapes those outcomes is outside of your direct control. You don't fully control culture. You don't fully control behavior. You don't fully control how people interpret policies or how quickly change actually takes hold. If that sounds familiar, not just in accreditation work, but in leadership more broadly, this episode is for you. Because it isn't a failure of leadership. It's a condition leadership now exists in. And today, I want to talk about what it means to lead well within those limits. Not critically, not defensively, but practically. Naming the leadership reality. Much of the language we still use about leadership assumes a level of control that most leaders simply don't have. We talk as if decisions lead directly to outcomes, plans lead neatly to implementation, and authority naturally produces alignment. But if you're doing real leadership work, you know it rarely feels that clean. Most leaders are navigating shared governance, professional autonomy, long-standing cultural norms, informal power structures, competing incentives, and limited institutional capacity. These are not design flaws. They're characteristics of complex organizations. And most leaders didn't create these systems. They inherited them. Yet, they're still expected to guide improvement, demonstrate progress, and steward the institution forward. If this resonates with you, whether you're in higher education, healthcare, nonprofits, or any mission-driven organization, it's because leadership today is less about control and more about responsibility without certainty. The central question becomes, how do I lead responsibly when I can't directly control the system? Where leadership influence actually lives. One of the most helpful shifts leaders can make is to stop focusing on what they don't control and start paying closer attention to where influence actually lives. Because while leaders may not control outcomes, they almost always shape three things. The first, attention. It's what leaders return to, what stays on the agenda, or what doesn't quietly disappear after the meeting ends. Over time, repeated attention signals importance more clearly than any directive. Second is framing. How challenges are named, whether issues are treated as failures, tensions, or learning opportunities, whether people feel blamed or invited into the work. Framing shapes whether people disengage or lean in. And third is permission. What it feels safe to talk about. What questions can be raised without penalty, or what uncertainty can be acknowledged honestly. Permission often determines whether improvement becomes performative or genuine. These forms of influence are subtle. They don't feel like authority, but in systems that don't respond well to command, they matter far more than issuing clearer instructions. Working with systems, not against them. Institutions, especially professional organizations, don't behave like machines. They behave like ecosystems. They respond slowly. They resist force. They change unevenly. When leaders expect immediate, uniform response, frustration builds for leaders and the people they're trying to lead. Effective leadership in these environments involves working within the system rather than against it. That means recognizing that change often emerges through shared meaning. Alignment develops through consistent goals, and improvement takes time to settle into habit. This kind of leadership can feel unsatisfying at first, especially for leaders who care deeply about progress. But over time, it produces changes that last, precisely because they weren't imposed. Planning as leadership practice. This is where planning plays a critical role, not as a tool for control, but as a leadership practice. When planning is used well, it doesn't force outcomes. Instead, it helps leaders coordinate understanding, surface assumptions, clarify priorities, and build shared language. The real value of planning isn't the document. It's what the process reveals about how people think, what they value, where alignment exists, and where it doesn't. When leaders approach planning as a conversation rather than a lever, it becomes a powerful way to lead within limits. If this podcast resonates you because planning often feels harder than it should, that's not a signal you're failing. It's often a sign you're engaging the work honestly. Continuous improvement as learning. The same perspective applies to continuous improvement. Improvement works best when it's framed as learning rather than performance. That doesn't mean lowering expectations or avoiding accountability. It means shifting the questions leaders ask. Instead of, did we fix it? Leaders should begin asking, what did we learn? What changed as a result? And what still needs time? Small, sustained adjustments often matter more than sweeping reforms. And leaders play a crucial role, not by demanding outcomes, but by normalizing iteration. When leaders model patience, curiosity, and follow-through, improvement becomes part of how the organization thinks, not just something it does when required. Accreditation as one practical example. This is where accreditation fits into the conversation, not as the center, but as a visible example. Accreditation often makes leadership limits more apparent. It highlights delayed outcomes, uneven authority, long feedback loops, and misalignment between intent and practice. For many leaders, accreditation becomes a moment when the difference between responsibility and control is impossible to ignore. But accreditation doesn't create these conditions. It simply makes them more visible. When approached thoughtfully, accreditation can function as a structured learning process, a prompt for institutional reflection, or a way to tell a coherent story about progress over time. Leaders who approach it this way often find it becomes less stressful, not because it's easier, but because expectations are more realistic. Leadership approaches that fit this reality. Different leadership approaches respond to limited control in different ways. Some leaders emphasize structure, creating clarity without coercion. Others emphasize adaptation, adjusting in response to emerging conditions. Some focus on interpretation, helping people make sense of change and see themselves within it. Others emphasize expression, building trust, shared identity, and relational commitment. And some leaders learn to hold paradox, accepting responsibility without dominance and influence without certainty. No single approach is sufficient on its own. Effective leadership within limits requires balance, awareness, and flexibility. What leading within limits actually looks like. In practice, Leading within limits looks quieter than traditional leadership narratives suggest. It looks like leaders who return to priorities consistently, protect time for reflection, resist the urge to overcorrect, and pay attention to how decisions land, not just how they're made. It looks like leaders who understand that credibility grows through coherence, trust develops through follow-through, and improvement emerges with sustained attention. This kind of leadership doesn't always announce itself, but over time, it shapes institutional behaviors in ways that last. Closing reflection. Leadership today isn't about removing limits. It's about leading thoughtfully within them. If this episode resonated with you, whether because of accreditation, planning, continuous improvement, or simply the weight of responsibility you carry, you're not alone. Many leaders are navigating systems that don't obey authority, and the real work of leadership is learning how to guide them anyway, not through control, but through influence, learning, and consistency over time. Leadership today is less about control and more about stewardship, influence, and learning over time. And the work of improvement doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds through attention, consistency, and trust. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find more episodes of Accreditation Unlocked and additional leadership reflections at accreditationcollaborative.com. I'm Dr. Ken Clough from the Accreditation Collaborative. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the leadership work you're doing every day.